The void sang with the dying breath of stars, a cosmic requiem that had echoed through the segmentum obscurus for 3 millennia, each note a civilization's final scream swallowed by the hungry dark. Ancient nebulae drifted like funeral shrouds between dead systems, their spectral light painting the hulls of derelict ships in shades of mourning and madness. Here, at the ragged edge of the Eye of Terror, where reality wore thin as parchment and the warp bled through in crimson tears, the Imperium's border worlds had learned to pray with weapons loaded and eyes turned away from the horizon. It was a place where hope came to die, where faith was tested in the crucible of endless night, and where the Emperor's light flickered like a candle in a hurricane of screaming souls. The Great Rift carved the galaxy in two, like a wound that would never heal. Yet still, impossibly, something moved in that terrible darkness, something that should not have survived, should not have endured, should not have returned. We share this tale with hearts full of love for you, our cherished listeners, for we truly care for each of you who seek solace in these chronicles of the grim, dark future. Before we begin this story of faith tested and transformed, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. The Immaculate Sorrow emerged from the warp storm like a cathedral dredged from a dream, her hull bearing geometries that hurt to perceive. Once pristine white and gold in the manner of all Sororitas vessels, she now carried the scars of 3 centuries in the immaterium, angles that folded back upon themselves, script that writhed across her armor, plating in languages that predated human speech, the convent ship's cathedral spires, those soaring monuments to faith that had once pierced the void like accusations against the darkness, now twisted in impossible spirals that seemed to reach toward dimensions that existed only in madness and mathematics. Runes flickered along her flanks like liquid mercury, not the crude marks of chaos corruption, but something older, more subtle. Yet for all the wrongness that clung to her like a second skin, the Immaculate Sorrow flew true, her engines burning with the steady light of unbroken purpose, her vox arrays singing hymns in perfect high Gothic as if no time had passed at all. Inquisitor Mordian Vex watched the convent ships approach through the armoured viewing ports of his strike cruiser, the unrelenting truth, and felt the familiar chill of the impossible settling into his bones. 300 years, 3 centuries since Canoness Superior Serafina Valdris had led her Order of the Crimson Veil into the Eye of Terror on a mission that even the most optimistic projections had deemed suicidal. The record spoke of desperate times, of faith crises that had shaken the ecclesiarchy to its foundations, of a relic so precious that its recovery might justify any sacrifice. The tears of Celestine, crystallized fragments of the living saint's own sorrow, said to grant visions of the Emperor's will to those pure enough to bear their weight. None had expected them to return, yet here they were, unchanged by time's passage, bearing impossible geometries like wounds that had learned to heal. "Inquisitor," came the voice of his aide, Interrogator Cassius Thane. "We're receiving a transmission from the convent ship. It's Canoness Valdris herself, sir. She's requesting permission to dock." Vex turned from the viewing port, his weathered face grave beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The main display flickered to life, revealing the interior of the Immaculate Sorrow's bridge, a chamber magnificent and terrible in equal measure, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to breathe, its stained glass windows depicting martyrdoms in impossible colours. At the centre of it all stood Canoness Superior Serafina Valdris, looking exactly as she had 3 centuries ago. Not younger, Not older, but precisely, exactly the same. Her raven black hair bound in ritual knots, her pale skin unmarked by years, her dark eyes burning with unwavering fervour, her power armour, blessed by Saint Celestine herself, showed no signs of wear despite 3 centuries in the most hostile environment known to human science. "Inquisitor Vex," she said, her voice carrying perfect clarity, "I am Canoness Superior Seraphina Valdris of the Order of the Crimson Veil. I request permission to dock and submit myself and my remaining sisters to your authority for examination. We have returned from our mission, and we bear gifts that the Imperium must receive, though the price of their giving may prove difficult to bear." Behind her, perhaps 30 sisters moved in the shadows, their crimson armour unmarked, their bearing that of warriors who had seen too much and survived too long. "Canoness," Vex replied, activating his transmission array. "You have been missing for 300 years. What happened in the Eye of Terror? How did you survive?" Seraphina's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of memory perhaps, or the weight of knowledge too heavy for mortal minds to carry. "We walked into the Garden of Thorns, Inquisitor, and we learned the difference between faith and truth. We sought the tears of Celestine, and we found them. But they showed us visions that no loyal servant of the Emperor was meant to see. We discovered that some heresies are more true than orthodoxy, that the Emperor's love for humanity may require us to become something more than human to survive what is coming." The transmission flickered, showing glimpses of crystalline chambers and figures kneeling before altars where something neither human nor divine waited with infinite patience. "We are still his daughters, Inquisitor. We are still faithful, but our faith has been refined, purified. This knowledge is the gift we bring, if the Imperium proves strong enough to receive it." Vex stared at the blank screen as the transmission ended, feeling the terrible gravity of decision settling upon him. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, yet something deeper whispered of opportunities that came once in millennia. "Grant them docking privileges," he said finally, his voice heavy with command. "But activate all containment protocols, full quarantine procedures, and Cassius, send word to Terra. Tell them the Order of the Crimson Veil has returned, bearing gifts from the Emperor himself." As the Immaculate Sorrow glided into the docking bay, her hull singing hymns in languages not heard since the dark age of technology, Vex wondered if he had just made the most important decision of his career, or the last mistake of his life. The sisters who had walked into the warp and returned were no longer quite the same beings who had departed, and the gifts they carried might prove to be blessings or curses in equal measure. 3 centuries passed, when the galaxy still harboured illusions of stability, and the Great Rift remained a prophet's nightmare. Ophelia Seven's convent sanctorum stood as a monument to unwavering faith. Its spires pierced amber skies like prayers made manifest, each stone blessed by martyrs' tears, each window crafted to transform distant starlight into something approaching divinity. Within those hallowed halls, Canoness Superior Seraphina Valdris knelt before the reliquary of Saint Lysander, her raven hair bound in ritual knots of command, her pale features serene as carved marble. Yet beneath that mask of perfect composure, doubt gnawed at her soul like cancer, feeding on the summons that had arrived sealed with the Aquila Imperialis 3 days prior. A summons that would demand everything she held sacred. The age of redemption was a time of desperate faith and fervent crusades, the ecclesiarchy's attempt to reclaim relevance after the devastation of Goge van Dier's reign. Hope was scarce as fertile soil, and in its place bloomed the thorny vines of fanaticism. The message bore signatures of 3 cardinal archbishops, their combined authority sufficient to move worlds and reshape the faith of billions. They demanded the impossible: retrieve the tears of Celestine from the demon world deep within the Eye of Terror. The tears of Celestine, crystallized fragments of the living saint's own sorrow, shed during her first martyrdom. Each tear contained divine will, capable of granting visions of the Emperor's purpose to those pure enough to bear revelation. Lost during the age of apostasy, hidden by heretics in realms where reality bent to chaos whims, they had remained beyond reach for 3 millennia. Now, with Xenos threats multiplying and chaos cults spreading like plague, the ecclesiarchy demanded their return. "Canoness," came a voice behind her, soft yet carrying decades of shared service. Sister Superior Lysandra approached with measured stride, her scarred features bearing marks of countless battles. She served as pragmatic counterweight to Seraphina's faith, her counsel valued precisely because it challenged rather than confirmed. "The cardinals grow impatient for your response." Seraphina rose, joints protesting the long vigil. "Tell me honestly, sister, do you believe this mission divinely inspired or politically motivated?" The question hung between them, like a blade. Lysandra studied the stained glass, depicting Saint Celestine's martyrdoms. The distinction may no longer matter. The ecclesiarchy faces existential threats. If the tears can provide guidance, perhaps the risk is justified. And if we sacrifice 200 sisters for political expediency disguised as divine mandate, then we die as we lived, came another voice from the chapel entrance. Sister Hospitaller Myriel entered with quiet grace, medical servitors trailing like metallic shadows. She had tended the order's wounded for 40 years, her hands healing bodies while words mended spirits. "We die in service to the Emperor's will, trusting faith sufficient to transform even failure into victory." Seraphina studied the 2 women, who had shaped her understanding of command and compassion. Lysandra, fierce and pragmatic, who saw political machinations clearly, but served nonetheless because duty transcended cynicism. Myriel, gentle and wise, who believed absolutely in the Emperor's love, while never flinching from its price. Between them lay the twin pillars of her faith: clear sight and courage despite imperfect knowledge. "Inquisitor Thane has requested audience," Seraphina continued. "His family has protected our order for 3 generations. If he supports this mission, then political pressures extend beyond the ecclesiarchy." Lysandra finished grimly. "The Inquisition sees opportunity in our potential sacrifice." "Or necessity," Myriel countered gently. "Perhaps they possess knowledge we lack, visions where the tears prove essential to humanity's survival." Inquisitor Lord Calen Thane had once been Seraphina's mentor, guiding her through early years as canoness, shaping her understanding of faith and duty. Now he was judge, his steely gaze unwavering as he presented the ecclesiarchy's demands. "The Emperor wills it, Seraphina," he had intoned with unshakable authority. "The tears are not merely relic, but beacon, promise. Without them, the Imperium risks succumbing to encroaching darkness. Your order possesses purest faith, strongest will. You are chosen." His words, once strength's source, now felt like chains binding her to unthinkable destiny. He had championed her, nurtured her, and now sent her to probable doom, all for desperate, flickering hope. The political pressures were immense, the Imperium crumbling, its bureaucratic machinery grinding toward oblivion. The ecclesiarchy sought to reassert authority after centuries of strife, seeing the tears as symbols of renewed divine favor, potent weapons against consuming despair. Serafina understood the strategic imperative, humanity's desperate need for rallying cries, but she also understood the cost. 200 faithful sisters marching toward realms where sanity frayed and souls were devoured. Her loyalty was unquestionable, but her understanding of the Emperor's will and the price of serving it was about to be irrevocably tested. Schedule the audience, Serafina decided finally, her voice carrying command's weight. We will hear what knowledge he brings, then pray for guidance. If the Emperor wills us to walk into the eye of terror, we shall do so with faith as shield and duty as sword. As her sisters departed, Serafina remained at the great window, watching sunset over Ophelia Seven's sacred spires. Tomorrow would bring answers or their illusion. The day after might bring departure, death, or something far worse. Tonight, she would pray as she had for 30 years, seeking the Emperor's will in silence between heartbeats, hoping that when time came to choose between faith and wisdom, she would possess courage to embrace both. The journey ahead was not merely physical, but a voyage into her soul's deepest recesses, where lines between duty, sacrifice, and damnation would blur beyond recognition. The immaculate sorrow pierced the veil between reality and nightmare with thunder like torn parchment, her consecrated hull singing ancient hymns as the Geller fields blazed around them like crystallized prayer. 200 sisters of the Crimson Veil knelt in perfect unison within the great cathedral, their voices weaving harmonies that had protected humanity since the dark age of technology. Outside the armored viewports, the eye of terror stretched in all its terrible majesty, a wound in reality where demon worlds spun around stars that burned with tortured souls, where the very concept of physics became a cruel jest whispered by mad gods. The transition should have been agony incarnate, a descent into realms where mortal minds shattered like glass against infinite malice. Instead, their faith blazed so brightly that the warp itself seemed to recoil, its chaotic currents parting before their vessel like crimson seas before divine will. Canoness, Superior Serafina, Valdris stood at the cathedral's heart, her power armor gleaming in candlelight, leading the litany of protection with unwavering voice. Sister Superior Lysandra monitored tactical displays from the transept, counting heartbeats and measuring breath, ensuring discipline never softened readiness. Sister Hospitaller Miriel moved among the novices with gentle hands, her presence an anchor of compassion amid the storm. For 6 hours their passage remained miraculously smooth, the navigator charting corridors through the maelstrom, while their combined devotion imposed order upon fundamental chaos. Then came the wrongness, subtle at first, too polite to name itself. Candles burned with flames that cast no shadows. The ship's chronometer began skipping minutes, losing hours, then inexplicably regaining them. Whispers drifted through Vox channels, not enemy communications, but fragments of forgotten prayers spoken backward, mournful cries that scraped against the soul. Gravity lagged whenever someone turned too quickly, and reflections in polished surfaces showed 20 sisters, where 19 stood. A statue of St. Catherine shed tears of machine oil that crawled upward and vanished into stone eyes. Miriel approached Serafina with characteristic calm, though questions haunted her gaze. Canoness, the sisters are experiencing physiological changes. Their heartbeats synchronize with the plasma drives, both pulsing in rhythm with warp currents. Their bodies adapt to the immaterium in ways that should not be possible for baseline humans. That night, Serafina knelt alone in her private chapel, seeking the Emperor's guidance as she had for 30 years. She expected familiar warmth, golden light that had sustained her through countless trials. Instead, she found herself in a vast chamber that existed nowhere aboard her ship, its walls covered with murals depicting humanity's history, from Terra's first steps to futures yet unborn. At the chamber's heart sat a figure upon a throne of crystallized time, and Seraphina recognized features that had graced 10,000 icons. Yet this was not the golden god of imperial doctrine, not the perfect father figure of a million prayers. This emperor was a labyrinth of will braided through epochs, a mind like a continent lit by decision storms, each lightning stroke burning millions to spare billions. She saw not benevolent divinity, but ancient necessity, hunter, surgeon, tyrant, and father, his gaze a sun that hurt because it noticed everything. His throne was wrought of cables and bone and stubborn refusal, his face a map of ruthless love bearing the weight of choices that had shaped galactic destiny. "My daughter," he spoke with voices of civilizations risen and fallen at his command, "you seek the tears of Celestine, but do not yet understand their nature. They are fragments of necessity itself, pieces of futures I have seen, and choices I have made to ensure humanity's survival. In finding them, you will learn truths that transform faith itself." The vision faded, leaving Seraphina gasping on cold deck plating, her armor's systems registering impossible physiological changes. Her heart beat in perfect synchronization with the Geller generators, and when she examined her hands, faint traceries of light pulsed beneath her skin like liquid starfire. Alarms suddenly blared throughout the ship. "Canoness," Lysandra's voice cut through growing unease. Geller fields fluctuating wildly, power surges intermittent, dropping to critical levels. Through the cathedral's great windows, impossible colors surged closer, pressing against failing defenses. The fields pulsed erratically, not random failure, but measured throbs that rose when choirs swelled and quieted when voices faltered. The Immaculate Sorrow had become a vessel adrift in pure terror, and Seraphina understood with chilling certainty that their true journey had only begun. The Emperor's face had been revealed, and it demanded a price she was only beginning to comprehend. The demon world Kithra bloomed before them like a fever dream, carved from crystallized blasphemy, its surface a patchwork of impossible beauty that made the eye weep and the soul recoil in equal measure. Where they had expected screaming skies and rivers of molten brass, they found gardens that stretched beyond horizons, their flowers blooming in colors that had no names in human language, petals that whispered forgotten prayers when touched by alien breezes. Crystalline spires rose from verdant meadows like cathedral bones thrust through emerald flesh, their surfaces reflecting not light but memory itself. Fragments of every oath sworn, every tear shed in the Emperor's name across 10 millennia of warfare and faith. The Immaculate Sorrow descended through atmosphere that tasted of incense and ash, her hull singing with harmonics that seemed to emerge from the world itself, as if the planet recognized their approach and welcomed them home with the patience of a gardener greeting expected guests. Sister Superior Lysandra stood at the observation deck, her scarred features tight with suspicion as she studied landing coordinates their navigator had somehow divined through methods that defied explanation. "This is wrong, Canoness," she whispered over private vox, her hand resting on her bolt pistol's grip as muscle memory demanded readiness even while her mind struggled to process the vista below. "Demon worlds are realms of torment, not paradise. Nothing in our codices prepared us for gardens and spires that borrow equally from imperial and heretical architecture. Canoness Superior Serafina Valdris felt the weight of the Emperor's vision pressing against her consciousness as she processed Lysandra's concerns. The terrible complexity of his true nature still burned in her memory, challenging every certainty she had cherished for 30 years of faithful service. Perhaps our understanding of demon worlds is incomplete, sister. Perhaps chaos is not the simple enemy we believed, but something far more nuanced, more patient in its corruptions. They made planetfall in a clearing surrounded by trees whose leaves sang hymns in languages that predated Terra's first civilizations, their branches heavy with fruit that gleamed like captured starlight. The landing party consisted of 30 sisters, their crimson armor gleaming beneath a sun that burned with gentle warmth, rather than the malevolent fury expected of chaos stars. Serafina led them through gardens where roses bloomed with petals of living flame, where fountains poured upward in defiance of gravity, where statues depicted scenes of martyrdom and glory that could have graced any imperial cathedral, if not for subtle wrongness in their proportions, suggestions that the martyrs had chosen their fate not from duty, but from understanding. At the garden's heart stood a temple that made Serafina's breath catch in her throat. Its architecture blended imperial Gothic with something older, more primal, columns that spiraled like DNA helixes reaching toward impossible heights, arches that formed infinity symbols, windows that showed not stained glass, but living light that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast, patient heartbeat. Above the entrance, carved in stone that seemed to shift between marble and obsidian depending on the viewing angle, were symbols that belonged neither to imperial nor chaos iconography, but to something that transcended both. The Aquila, Lysandra whispered, pointing to familiar imagery worked into the temple's facade with masterful skill. But look closer. The two-headed eagle was there, magnificent and terrible, but its wings bore feathers of both light and shadow. Its eyes gazed in directions that encompass past and future simultaneously, and beneath its talons lay not the orb of terror, but a sphere that contained swirling galaxies, infinite possibilities, the weight of choices yet unmade. Within the temple's sanctuary, they found the tears of Celestine resting upon an altar of crystallized time. But the relics were no longer the simple fragments of sorrow described in imperial doctrine. The tears had become something far more complex, obsidian prisms that contained not just visions of divine will, but reflections of truth itself, each crystal showing different scenes that hurt to witness directly. The Emperor's first steps upon Terra, his bargains with powers beyond mortal understanding, the necessity of choices that had damned billions to save trillions, the weight of love so vast it required cruelty to preserve what mattered most. Serafina approached with reverent steps, her hands trembling as she lifted the nearest tear. The moment her fingers touched consecrated crystal, visions flooded her consciousness. Not the comforting certainties of imperial propaganda, but raw truth in all its terrible complexity. She saw the Emperor not as perfect father, but as gardener, tending humanity's growth, pruning away weakness with surgical precision, nurturing strength through trials that seemed like abandonment to those who could not perceive the greater pattern. Canoness, Lysandra's voice cut through Revelation's storm as she watched her commander's armor begin to bear traceries of light that pulsed with each heartbeat. The tear is changing you. Indeed, Serafina's eyes now reflected depths that had not existed moments before, as if the relic were not simply showing her visions, but transforming her into something capable of bearing truth without madness. "I understand now," Serafina whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. This mission was never about retrieving a simple relic. It was about preparing us to become vessels for revelation, fragments of his own understanding made manifest in mortal flesh. Lysandra stepped back, pragmatic mind connecting patterns with growing alarm. Or we have walked into the most subtle trap ever laid, Canoness. How do we know these visions come from the Emperor and not from powers that seek to corrupt us through our own faith? Consider the possibility that we have been cultivated, guided here by forces that understand our devotion better than we understand ourselves. The question hung between them like a blade, cutting through certainty to reveal the terrible possibility that their devotion itself might be the instrument of their downfall. The temple air shifted like a held breath released, and from the crystalline shadows between altar and arch came something that made reality bend at its edges. The demon prince materialized not through dramatic entrance, but through recognition, as if it had always been there, waiting for eyes capable of seeing past comfortable illusions. Its form was magnificent and terrible in equal measure, wearing armor that had once been pristine white and gold, now transformed into something that shifted between blessed ceramite and living shadow, each plate inscribed with prayers answered too completely. Tattered wings of parchment spread behind shoulders that bore the weight of millennia, each feather a scripture that whispered of faith betrayed and love corrupted. Its face might have graced any imperial cathedral, noble features unmarked by time, eyes that burned with the cold fire of absolute understanding, if not for the crown of thorns that wept liquid starlight, and the terrible patience that spoke of truths learned through damnation. I am Orestes of Caligine. It spoke with voices like cathedral bells cracking under impossible weight, each word carrying harmonics that resonated in the sister's bones, once called saint by the ecclesiarchy, martyred in the Macarian crusade, and raised to glory by popular acclaim. I walked the emperor's path for 3 centuries before learning what holiness costs when you refuse to look away from its true nature. Sister Superior Lysandra's bolt pistol snapped to ready position, her scarred features tight with the discipline of decades. Demon Prince, she stated with flat certainty, though her voice carried undertones of doubt that had not existed before their journey began. You wear stolen names and speak borrowed truths. It is a habit of empires, Orestes replied, with something that might have been amusement, if amusement could carry such weight of sorrow. They call conquest stewardship and design mercy to look like order. Will you hear why I wear mine? Or will you cling to comfortable certainties that serve no one save those who profit from your ignorance? The demon prince gestured to the temple walls, where new murals began manifesting in living stone, scenes that no imperial historian would sanction, visions that hurt to witness directly. The emperor's unification of terror, shown not as glorious conquest, but as systematic genocide of those who refused his singular vision. The Great Crusade revealed as deliberate expansion designed to create enemies that would forge humanity into weapons. The Horus heresy depicted not as tragic betrayal, but as necessary catalyst, forcing evolution through trauma that would prepare mankind for wars yet unimagined. He knew Horus would fall, Orestes continued, his voice carrying conviction that made several sisters step backward in horror. The Chaos Gods were never his enemies, but his tools, carefully cultivated to ensure humanity would never know peace, never grow soft, never stop becoming the psychic weapon he needs for conflicts that dwarf your current understanding. He is no benevolent father watching over humanity from his golden throne. He is a gardener pruning his crop, a surgeon cutting away weakness, a tyrant whose love requires absolute dominion over every aspect of human existence. Canoness Superior. Serafina Valdris felt the tears of Celestine burning in her hands, their visions warring with lifelong certainties, creating fractures in her understanding that this creature's presence threatened to widen into chasms. You offer revelation wrapped in blasphemy. How do we distinguish truth from corruption when both wear the same face? Truth liberates the conscience to choose its chains, Orestes answered, his gaze encompassing all the assembled sisters with mixture of pity and recognition. The Emperor chooses his. You must choose yours. But know this. Hope is a candle that burns the bearer, and love is a blade that cuts both victim and savior. Your devotion is not accident but careful cultivation, bred across generations to serve purposes you were never meant to comprehend. The effect was immediate and devastating. Some sisters fell to their knees, clutching Aquilas, while their minds reeled from assault on their most sacred beliefs. Others stood transfixed, their eyes reflecting new understanding that transformed their features from within. Sister Helena, a zealous firebrand, cried, "Blasphemy! The Emperor protects," but her voice wavered like a cracked bell. Sister Vanya, the quiet scholar, lowered her bolter entirely, gaze fixed on the demon prince with terrible fascination. "If what you say holds truth," she whispered, "then our entire purpose, our entire history, becomes something else entirely." The order was fracturing along lines of belief, unity shattered by truths too complex for simple acceptance or rejection. Accusations of heresy mingled with cries of dawning understanding, the sanctuary becoming a crucible where faith itself was being reforged in fires of revelation. It was Sister Hospitaller Miriel who stepped between the opposing factions, her gentle presence somehow commanding attention despite lacking rank or martial prowess. She had spent 40 years tending the Order's wounded, her hands healing bodies while her words mended spirits, and now she faced the greatest wound of all, the fracture of certainty itself. "Sisters," she said quietly, her voice carrying authority earned through decades of service, "we face revelation that challenges everything we believed. But perhaps the question is not whether these truths are real, but what we choose to do with them." She turned to address Orestes directly, showing no fear despite facing a creature that could unmake her with a thought. "If the Emperor is truly as you describe, gardener, surgeon, tyrant, does that make our service meaningless? Or does it make our choice to serve more precious because we serve with understanding rather than ignorance?" The demon prince's expression shifted, surprise flickering across features that had forgotten how to show genuine emotion. "You would serve a tyrant knowingly." "I would serve love," Miriel replied, with simple conviction that cut through philosophical complexity like a blade through silk. "Even love that requires terrible choices, even love that must sometimes be cruel to preserve what matters most. If the Emperor truly orchestrates our trials to make us stronger, to prepare us for wars beyond our comprehension, then perhaps our duty is not blind obedience but conscious partnership in that great work. Love is not blind, and duty need not be cruel. We can choose to see and still refuse what corrodes the heart. We can carry a burden and still refuse to become the burden." Her words created silence that stretched like held breath, the psychic storm of revelation calming under her unshakable faith. Not faith in comfortable lies, but faith that had learned to embrace complexity without surrendering compassion. Several sisters removed their helmets, revealing faces transformed by understanding. Their devotion evolved rather than abandoned. "You offer us a choice," Serafina said finally, addressing the demon prince with newfound clarity, while feeling the weight of command settle upon her shoulders like lead. Embrace these revelations and be transformed, or cling to comfortable lies and remain as we were. But there is a third path, to accept truth and choose our response to it, to serve not from ignorance, but from love that has learned to see clearly. Orestes bowed, a monarch acknowledging a rival realm. Then walk while your faith still sings, it said, its form already beginning to fade back into shadow and memory. The next gate opens to those who can carry contradiction without choosing despair. But beware the sweetness of refusing hard arithmetic. Compassion is a blade that cuts both victim and savior. As the demon prince dissolved into the temple's crystalline air, the sisters stood transformed. The fracture lines in their order had become permanent, but perhaps that too was part of a design larger than any of them could comprehend. Some looked to Seraphina and saw a leader crowned with terrible wisdom. Others saw a woman beginning to love truth more than victory. Between them, Muriel walked as living proof that understanding need not require abandoning the heart. They turned from the altar in disciplined formation, yet each step carried them further from the certainties they had known toward futures that would demand everything they had learned about faith, duty, and the price of seeing clearly in a universe built upon necessary lies. The temple's crystalline walls pulsed with dying light as the order of the crimson veil stood divided, their unity shattered like ceramite beneath the weight of revelation, too vast for mortal faith to bear. The encounter with Orestes had carved fractures through their brotherhood that now gaped like wounds, separating them not by rank or experience, but by their capacity to embrace contradiction without surrendering hope. Some sisters clutched their Aquilus with trembling fingers, their faces pale beneath harsh temple light, as whispers of heresy and blasphemy drifted through ranks that had once sung in perfect harmony. Others stood in contemplative silence, their eyes reflecting depths that had not existed before the demon prince's discourse, as if they were seeing the universe itself for the first time through lenses ground from necessity and terrible understanding. Canoness, Superior Seraphina Valdris, felt the weight of command transform into something beyond authority as she studied her fractured order, the tears of Celestine burning in her gauntlets like captured stars. These were no longer mere relics, but windows into futures that stretched beyond mortal comprehension, each crystal surface showing visions that made the soul weep for possibilities both magnificent and damning. The choice before them transcended simple questions of loyalty or heresy. It demanded they decide what humanity itself might become. "We stand at the crossroads of destiny," she began, her voice carrying across the temple with authority earned through 3 decades of faithful service. "We have seen truths that challenge everything we believed, learned secrets that the Imperium was never meant to bear. Now we must choose. Do we return with this knowledge, or do we die here as martyrs, preserving the comfortable certainties that have sustained mankind for 10 millennia? Sister Helena stepped forward, her scarred features rigid with orthodox conviction. "We have been contaminated by lies wrapped in truth's clothing," she declared, her voice cracking like breaking stone. "The demon prince spoke blasphemies designed to corrupt our faith from within, using our own devotion as the weapon of our undoing. Our duty is clear. We must die here, die clean, rather than return bearing poison that would spread through the ecclesiarchy like plague through a hive city." Around her, perhaps 60 sisters nodded with grim agreement, their hands moving not to weapons but to prayer beads, preparing for martyrdom rather than battle. They had seen too much, learned truths that made their continued existence a threat to everything they had sworn to protect. Sister Superior Lysandra countered with pragmatic steel. Martyrdom is the coward's solution, she stated flatly, her battle-scarred face hard with resolve. We sought the tears of Celestine to serve the Imperium's needs, not to flee from difficult knowledge. If what we have learned is true, then our duty is to return with understanding that might reshape humanity's destiny. If it is false, then we are strong enough to bear lies without being broken by them. Between the opposing factions stood Sister Hospitale Miriel, her gentle presence somehow commanding attention despite the storm of conflicting voices. Perhaps we should ask the relics themselves what they would have us do, she suggested quietly, approaching the altar where the tears rested, their surfaces pulsing with inner light that seemed to respond to her proximity. Love and duty need not require blindness, sisters. There may be wisdom in the middle path. Serafina lifted the largest tear, feeling its weight like a fragment of destiny itself. Show us, she commanded, and the crystal blazed with light that pierced flesh and bone to illuminate the soul directly. Visions flooded the temple with the force of revelation unbound, painting the walls with futures yet unborn. They saw humanity's possible destinies spreading like branches of an infinite tree. In one timeline, the Imperium continued its slow decay, faith calcifying into rigid orthodoxy that strangled growth and innovation, leaving mankind vulnerable to extinction when true threats emerged from the galactic void. In another, the revelations they carried sparked civil wars that tore the Imperium apart, chaos feeding on conflict until nothing remained but screaming darkness. But there were other possibilities, futures where dangerous knowledge became the seed of transformation, where humanity learned to embrace complexity without abandoning compassion. They witnessed children born with psychic abilities integrated rather than feared, worlds where the warp became a tool rather than a threat, civilizations that had evolved beyond current limitations to stand against horrors not yet imagined. The Emperor's grand design reached fruition through conscious partnership rather than blind obedience, humanity ascending to become something worthy of the galaxy's challenges. I see the price, Helena whispered, tears streaming down her face as the visions overwhelmed her senses. Billions dead, entire sectors consumed by civil war, the Imperium's strength shattered against the altar of progress. How many innocents must die for these visions to become reality? And I see the necessity, Sister Vanya responded, her scholar's mind grasping implications that others feared to acknowledge. Humanity must evolve or perish. The Emperor's love demands we become something greater than we are, even if the transformation requires sacrifice beyond imagination. The order fractured along lines of belief and understanding. Helena's faction, perhaps 50 strong, stepped away from the main group with faces etched by conviction born of terror and loyalty. We cannot carry these truths back, Helena declared with finality. We will not be the hand that shatters the Imperium's faith. Let us remain here, sisters. Let our martyrdom be the silence that protects the Emperor's children from revelations they cannot bear. Lysandra watched them with mixture of respect and frustration. And I will not let knowledge die because it challenges comfortable lies, she responded. If the Emperor truly orchestrates these trials to make us stronger, then our duty is to embrace strength wherever it leads, even if it leads through darkness. Muriel moved between the factions like a bridge made flesh. Some could remain as guardians of this knowledge until humanity grows ready to receive it, she suggested with healer's wisdom. Others could return with partial truths, preparing ground for revelations yet to come. We need not choose between all or nothing when wisdom suggests the middle way. As the order divided into 3 groups, martyrs who would die to preserve orthodoxy, witnesses who would return as agents of change, and guardians who would remain in the eye of terror as keepers of dangerous truth. Seraphina felt her role transform from commander to fulcrum, upon which humanity's future might balance. The temple fell silent except for soft weeping of those who understood they were witnessing both ending and beginning. The tears of Celestine pulsed with inner light, showing that even this fracture served purposes beyond mortal comprehension, each fragment destined to play its role in designs that stretched across millennia. They had walked into the Garden of Thorns seeking simple relics and found instead the seeds of transformation that would reshape everything humanity believed about itself, the Emperor, and the price of evolution in a universe that devoured the weak and demanded strength from those who would survive its trials. The warp storm embraced the Immaculate Sorrow like a mother cradling a fevered child, its tendrils of unreality seeping through blessed ceramite and consecrated steel to caress the souls within. Time became liquid, flowing backward and forward in currents that defied mortal understanding, while the Geller fields pulsed in rhythms that belonged to no earthly heartbeat. Canoness, Superior Seraphina Valdres, felt her consciousness expand beyond the confines of flesh, her awareness stretching across millennia like gossamer threads caught in cosmic winds. The surviving sisters found themselves suspended between real space and the warp, trapped in a temporal anomaly that transformed their minds into vessels for experiences spanning the breadth of imperial history. The ship's cathedral became a theatre where eternity performed its greatest tragedies. Stained glass windows showed not static saints but moving tableaux of moments that had shaped humanity's destiny, each pane reflecting different epochs simultaneously. Sister Superior Lysandra gripped the altar rail as visions flooded her pragmatic mind, while Sister Hospitaller Miriel moved through the ranks with gentle hands, anchoring her sisters to sanity as reality dissolved around them. The Horus heresy erupted before them with terrible intimacy, not as distant legend, but as lived experience that seared their souls. They walked the decks of the vengeful spirit as Horus made his final choice, felt the weight of his love for the Emperor transform into something darker and more necessary. Seraphina witnessed the War Master's corruption, not as simple betrayal, but as orchestrated tragedy, understanding for the first time that even this greatest of heresies served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. She saw the Emperor's own agony as he guided his son's fall, recognizing that love itself had become the instrument of necessity, that every choice weighed against futures where humanity faced extinction. The siege of terror unfolded with crushing weight, showing them defenders who died believing they fought for survival, never knowing their sacrifice served designs spanning millennia. They felt the Emperor's pain as he struck down his most beloved son, understanding that the Golden Throne was not symbol of dominion, but cage of sacrifice, freely chosen to protect humanity from powers he had once harnessed. The age of apostasy followed like fever breaking, showing them Goge Vandir's reign of terror and the birth of their own sisterhood from ashes of corruption. Miriel wept as she witnessed the suffering masses, innocent souls burning while faith twisted into tyranny, but she also saw Sebastian Thor rising like dawn after endless night, proving that even in darkness, true devotion could ignite revolution of spirit. The daughters of the Emperor transformed into Adepta Sororitas, not through divine inspiration but careful orchestration, the Emperor's will working through seemingly random events to create instruments he would need for missions like theirs. Future visions accelerated past them like shooting stars, each possibility blazing with potential glory or damnation. They saw timelines where their knowledge sparked transformation, elevating humanity beyond current limitations. worlds where psychic children were trained rather than feared, where the warp became ally rather than enemy, where the species evolved into something capable of standing against threats from beyond the galactic rim. They witnessed the Emperor's final gambit, his resurrection not as God Emperor of doctrine, but as something far more complex, a being who had learned to love humanity enough to let it grow beyond his control. But they also saw alternatives, futures where orthodoxy preserved led to stagnation and extinction, where devotion became tomb, as humanity proved incapable of adapting to challenges requiring growth beyond comfortable certainties. Every choice rippled across centuries. Every decision weighted against survival of the species itself. We were never meant to simply retrieve relics, Serafina realized, as understanding crystallized in her expanded consciousness. This entire mission was orchestrated to create us, to transform us into vessels capable of carrying revelations that would otherwise destroy mortal minds. We are not sisters who happened upon dangerous knowledge. We are weapons forged in the crucible of revelation itself. Lysandra's pragmatic mind grasped the tactical implications with growing horror and admiration. The Emperor knew when he scattered the Primarchs, knew when he allowed the heresy, knew when he ascended the Golden Throne. Every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of apparent failure was calculated to bring us to this point, to create the instruments he needed for humanity's next evolution. Miriel watched the visions with healer's eyes, seeing not just grand design, but its cost in individual suffering. Love is a blade that cuts both victim and savior, she whispered, understanding now why the demon prince had spoken with such mixture of admiration and horror. The Emperor's love for humanity requires him to orchestrate our trials, to guide us through suffering that will make us stronger. The anomaly began collapsing, reality reasserting itself with grinding sound of cosmic machinery returning to function. As awareness returned to mortal forms, the surviving sisters found themselves changed in ways beyond simple knowledge. They had witnessed the true scope of the Emperor's design, understood their role in plans spanning millennia, accepted terrible responsibility of carrying revelations that could transform or damn the species they served. The longest night was ending, but dawn it heralded would demand everything they had learned about faith, duty, and the price of seeing clearly in a universe built upon necessary lies. The Immaculate Sorrow drifted through dimensions that existed only in the spaces between heartbeats, her hull singing hymns that had learned new harmonies during their passage through temporal storms. The great cathedral no longer echoed with the uniform devotion of unquestioning servants, but with something far more complex, prayers that carried the weight of conscious choice, voices that had learned to embrace contradiction without surrendering hope. The surviving sisters knelt in formations that were almost perfect, the last fractions of deviation now deliberate witness to faith that had become voluntary rather than reflexive. Where once their devotions had been shields against thought, now they were bridges toward understanding. Canoness. Superior Serafina Valdris felt the transformation most acutely as she stood before the nave's altar, the weight of revelation settling into her bones like lead transmuted into purpose. The visions of the longest night had burned away the comfortable certainties of 3 decades, leaving behind something harder and more precious, understanding that could serve love even when love demanded terrible choices. She was no longer merely a faithful servant following orders without question, but a conscious guardian who chose her service with full knowledge of its price. The Emperor's true face haunted her memory, not the golden god of imperial doctrine, but a being of ruthless necessity, a gardener who pruned humanity's growth with surgical precision, a father whose love required orchestrating trials that would forge strength from suffering. Sister Hospitaller Muriel moved among the novices with gentle hands, her presence an anchor of compassion in the storm of transformation that had swept through their ranks. Her 40 years of tending the wounded had taught her to recognize when healing required acceptance of scars, when wholeness could only come through integration of trauma rather than its denial. She whispered words of comfort to sisters whose minds still reeled from witnessing millennia compressed into moments, helping them understand that their expanded awareness was gift rather than curse, burden rather than blessing. The ship's machine spirits muttered grievances along cogitator spines, their artificial consciousness struggling to process the changes that had swept through every system during the temporal anomaly. The Geller field generators pulsed erratically, their protective barriers straining against forces that pressed against the hull like hungry mouths seeking entrance. Reality itself seemed to resist their emergence, as if the universe recognized they carried knowledge that could reshape its fundamental nature. Canoness, Sister Superior Lysandra called from her position at the tactical displays, her scarred features tight with concentration that had not relaxed since the anomaly began. The warp storms are intensifying beyond all parameters. Our navigator reports dimensional instabilities that shouldn't exist. Corridors that fold back on themselves, currents that flow in temporal loops. The eye of terror itself is attempting to reclaim us, drawing us back toward the demon worlds we escaped. Serafina approached the tactical station, studying the swirling patterns of energy that surrounded their vessel like a cosmic maelstrom. The storms were not random chaos, but followed patterns that suggested intelligence behind their fury, as if the powers of the Immaterium recognized the threat posed by sisters who had learned to see clearly while maintaining their devotion to humanity's cause. The return to real space would not be granted freely. It would require sacrifice of the kind that had defined their order since its founding. The Geller field matrix has been corrupted by temporal resonance, Lysandra continued, her voice carrying undertones of grim calculation. The generators are losing coherence, falling out of phase with each other. Standard repair protocols are insufficient. The damage exists on levels that transcend mere mechanical failure. She paused, her steel-grey eyes meeting Serafina's with terrible clarity. There is another way. The fields can be overloaded to create a cascade effect that would tear open a rift to real space, but it requires a living mind to serve as stabilizing matrix, someone capable of maintaining harmonic frequency while the systems collapse around them. The implications settled over the assembled sisters like a funeral shroud. They had already lost so many, those who chose martyrdom to preserve orthodoxy, those who remained as guardians of dangerous knowledge. Now the survivors faced another division, another choice between service and self-preservation, another test of faith that had learned to embrace sacrifice as conscious choice rather than blind obedience. "I will take the burden," Serafina began, but Lysandra's refusal came swift as a blade stroke. "No, Canoness. The field stabilization requires tactical expertise, intimate knowledge of ship systems that only I possess. More than that, it requires a mind trained to think in straight lines while reality bends around it." Lysandra's voice carried conviction, earned through decades of pragmatic service, her understanding of necessity refined by visions that had shown her the true scope of the Emperor's design. "My faith has always been in his grand architecture, in the mathematics of survival that govern galactic destiny. The anomaly showed me the truth of that design, the necessity of every sacrifice, the love that expresses itself through willing loss. She moved toward the auxiliary Geller field console with steady steps, her hands already dancing across interfaces that sparked with barely contained energies. You must carry the revelations back to the Imperium Canonis. You must plant seeds of understanding in soil prepared to receive them. My purpose was to see you through the darkness. Now it is to ensure you return with the light. Muriel stepped between them, her healer's wisdom recognizing the inevitability of the choice, while seeking to honor its emotional weight. Love does not demand blindness, she said quietly, but it does require honesty about who can bear what burden. This is not abandonment, but completion. The final verse of a hymn that began, "When you first took command of this order." Seraphina felt something break and reform in her chest, understanding flooding through her like liquid fire. This was the moment of transformation she had sensed approaching. Not just personal evolution, but the birth of something new in the galaxy's spiritual landscape. Lysandra's sacrifice would not be mere martyrdom, but conscious partnership in the Emperor's great work, proof that faith could evolve without abandoning its essential truth. "Sister," Seraphina said formally, though her voice carried warmth that transcended rank, "your sacrifice honors not just our order, but the species we serve. Your death will become seed of transformation, demonstration that understanding strengthens rather than weakens devotion." Lysandra initiated the overload sequence, reality screaming as dimensional barriers strained beyond their limits. Energy cascaded through the ship's systems like liquid starfire, and she stood at its center, her armor blazing with forces that transform flesh into something beyond mortal limitations. She became living conduit between real space and the warp, her sacrifice creating the bridge their vessel needed to escape the eye's hungry grasp. As the Immaculate Sorrow tore free with thunder like breaking worlds, emerging into normal space where distant stars burned with clean light, Seraphina understood that her transformation was complete. She was no longer faithful servant, but conscious guardian, carrying revelations that would either save humanity or damn it forever. The choice would belong to those with courage to embrace dangerous truth, but she would ensure they had that choice to make. The ship flew toward distant beacons, bearing sisters who had learned that love sometimes required seeing clearly, that faith could evolve without abandoning its heart, and that the Emperor's greatest gift to humanity might be the freedom to choose its own destiny with full knowledge of the price such freedom demanded. The Immaculate Sorrow emerged from the eye of terror's crimson embrace, like a prayer answered by a god who had forgotten how to speak mercy, her hull bearing geometries that made reality weep, while her vox arrays sang hymns in perfect high Gothic, as if 3 centuries had passed in a single heartbeat. The warp released them with reluctance, its tendrils of unreality clinging to consecrated ceramite before dissolving into auroras that painted the void in colors that had no names in human language. Before them stretched an Imperium transformed beyond recognition, carved hollow by wars that had consumed entire sectors and left scars across the galaxy's flesh that would never heal. The great rift split the heavens like a wound torn by angry gods, its baleful light painting dead worlds in shades of madness, while chaos fleets prowled between dying stars. Where once the Emperor's light had burned steady if distant, now it flickered like a candle in hurricane winds, maintained only by the fevered devotion of billions who had learned to pray with weapons loaded and eyes turned toward horizons that promised only suffering. Vox channels carried desperation instead of triumph. Astropathic choirs sang laments rather than victory hymns, and the very fabric of space seemed strained by conflicts that dwarfed the struggles they remembered. Canonis, Superior Serafina Valdris, stood at the great viewing port, watching Imperial Navy patrol ships approach with weapons powered but not yet targeted, their captains clearly struggling to process the impossible sight before them. 23 sisters knelt in perfect formation within the cathedral behind her, their crimson armor unmarked by time's passage, their faces bearing the weight of revelations that had transformed them from faithful servants into conscious guardians of truths. Too dangerous for mortal minds to bear. They were no longer quite human, no longer entirely mortal, changed by their journey through realms where faith became physics and devotion took physical form. The isolation struck them like a physical blow. Their eyes, accustomed to seeing the Emperor not as a static icon, but as a complex force of necessity and love, now found the ubiquitous images of the Golden Throne jarring in their simplicity. The fervent, unquestioning devotion radiating from imperial forces felt like regression into blindness, a step backward from the understanding they had paid so dearly to achieve. They were daughters who had returned home only to find themselves strangers in a realm that no longer recognized what they had become. Sister Hospitaller Miriel moved among the survivors with gentle hands, her presence an anchor of compassion amid the storm of alienation. She felt their subtle tremors, saw how their gazes lingered on the empty void, as if searching for the terrible beauty of truths they could no longer unsee. 40 years of tending wounds had taught her to recognize when healing required acceptance of scars, and she understood that their transformation was both gift and burden, blessing and curse, intertwined beyond separation. Incoming transmission, Sister Vanya reported from the communications array, her scholar's mind struggling to process technological advances that 3 centuries had wrought. Imperial Navy Command, Battle Fleet Obscurus. They demand identification and submission to quarantine protocols. The main display revealed the bridge of a massive battleship, bristling with weapons that belonged to no pattern in their memory. The captain who addressed them was young by their standards, perhaps 40 years, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the galaxy's slow collapse firsthand. His uniform bore decorations, speaking of victories won against impossible odds, his bearing that of a man who had learned to find hope in duty rather than certainty. "Unknown vessel," he began, his voice carrying authority earned through trials that had claimed entire fleets. "You bear sororitas iconography, but our records show no convent ship of your configuration. State your identity and prepare for boarding." Serafina activated her transmission array, feeling the terrible gravity of the moment settling upon her shoulders. Every word would be weighed against orthodoxy, every revelation measured against the Imperium's desperate need for certainty in an age of chaos. "I am Canoness Superior Serafina Valdris of the Order of the Crimson Veil. We departed 3 centuries past to retrieve the tears of Celestine. We have returned bearing knowledge that the Imperium must receive, though the price of its giving may prove difficult to bear." The captain's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching awe. 3 centuries, he repeated, disbelief warring with recognition in his voice. The Order of the Crimson Veil was declared lost with all hands. "We claim nothing," Serafina replied carefully, choosing each word with precision born of necessity. "We offer testimony of what we witnessed, understanding of what we learned, and service regardless of how that service may be received. The galaxy has changed, Captain. Perhaps it has changed enough to receive truths that would once have been deemed heretical." Behind her, the surviving sisters maintained their vigil, their presence a reminder that some knowledge could only be carried by those who had paid its price in full. The return to imperial space was not homecoming, but exile's end, the beginning of a new kind of service that would require everything they had learned about balancing truth with mercy, revelation with protection, understanding with love. They were prodigal daughters bearing gifts that might prove blessings or curses, isolated by understanding that transcended the comfortable certainties their species required for survival. The choice of what to do with such dangerous wisdom would belong to those with courage to distinguish between necessary truths and comforting lies. The interrogation chamber aboard the Unrelenting Truth bore the austere functionality of inquisitorial design, its walls lined with hexagrammic wards that whispered prayers against corruption, while servo skulls circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their auger arrays recording every heartbeat, every micro-expression that might betray heretical thought. The obsidian table at the chamber's heart reflected faces in dark mirror, its polished surface seeming to judge both interrogator and subject with equal severity. Here, in the space between sanctioned liturgy and surgical examination, truth would be weighed against necessity, revelation measured against the Imperium's desperate need for certainty in an age of chaos. Inquisitor Cassius Thane sat across from Canoness Superior Seraphina Valdris, his steel-grey eyes carrying the weight of inherited purpose. The resemblance to his grandfather was uncanny, the same sharp features that had once sponsored their original mission, the same intellectual intensity that worried at problems until truth emerged bloody and raw. He was young for an inquisitor, barely past his first century of service, but he possessed the keen intellect and unwavering faith that had made his bloodline legendary within the Ordo Hereticus. Seraphina recognized the genetic legacy immediately, understanding that this interrogation was not random assignment, but orchestrated encounter, another piece in designs that stretched across generations. 3 centuries, Thane began, his voice carrying undertones of disbelief that warred with the evidence before him. 300 years in the eye of terror, and you emerge, unchanged by time's passage, your armor unmarked by battle, your faith apparently intact despite exposure to corruption that destroys space marines within hours. His augmetic eye whirred as it focused on details invisible to baseline human perception. Explain how this is possible without invoking miracles that strain credibility beyond breaking. Seraphina chose her words with precision born of necessity, walking the razor's edge between truth and heresy with steps measured by decades of command. Faith became our shield, Inquisitor. Not blind devotion, but conscious choice to serve the Emperor's will, regardless of how that will might manifest. We learned to see his design in events that appeared chaotic, to find his love in trials that seemed like abandonment. Each word was carefully weighted, carrying enough truth to satisfy augur arrays, while concealing revelations that would damn them all. The interrogation progressed with methodical precision, Thane's questions probing deeper, while Seraphina danced between revelation and concealment. She spoke of their passage through warp storms, describing how their combined faith had imposed order upon fundamental chaos without mentioning the impossible geometries their ship had absorbed. She testified to their discovery of the demon world Kithra, presenting it as garden of trials overcome rather than realm, where imperial and chaos iconography blurred together in blasphemous harmony. The tears of Celestine, Thane continued, gesturing to the crystalline relics resting in their containment field. Your reports describe them as transformed, no longer simple fragments of sorrow, but prisms showing visions of divine will. What did these visions contain? Truth, Seraphina replied simply, then elaborated with careful precision. They showed us the Emperor's hand in orchestrating events across millennia, guiding humanity's evolution through trials that seemed like abandonment to those who could not perceive the greater pattern. We saw his love for our species, a love so vast it encompasses even cruelty when cruelty serves the purpose of making us stronger. She did not mention the visions of the Horus heresy as orchestrated necessity, or the revelation that chaos itself served as tool in the Emperor's grand design. She spoke only of his ultimate purpose, humanity's survival and evolution, while omitting the terrible methods by which that purpose was achieved. Thane leaned forward, his intellect passing implications she hoped to conceal. You speak of orchestration rather than divine protection. The demon world that appeared as paradise rather than torture chamber. The entity that offered revelation rather than simple corruption. The temporal anomaly that granted visions rather than madness. These events follow patterns that suggest deliberate design. Perhaps the Emperor's protection manifests in ways that transcend our understanding, Seraphina replied carefully. Perhaps what appears as coincidence serves purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The young inquisitor stood, pacing the chamber with restless energy that spoke of a mind grappling with concepts too vast for simple classification. His grandfather's files spoke of faith crises that had shaken the ecclesiarchy 3 centuries past, of desperate measures taken to retrieve relics that might restore divine favor. The mission had been deemed suicidal, yet here sat its survivors, unchanged by time and bearing knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of faith itself. Tell me about the temporal anomaly, Thane commanded. Your ship's chronometer records suggest you experienced centuries of imperial history simultaneously. What did you witness during those lost hours? Seraphina's composure remained perfect as she described their entrapment between dimensions, their simultaneous experience of past and future, the evolution of their faith from blind devotion to conscious choice. She spoke of witnessing the Emperor's grand design unfold across millennia, of understanding how every sacrifice served larger purposes, of learning to love him not for what they believed him to be, but for what he truly was. She did not mention seeing the deliberate orchestration of humanity's trials, the calculated use of suffering as forge for strength, the terrible necessity that drove every choice across 10,000 years of warfare and faith. Sister Superior Lysandra's sacrifice, Thane pressed, his voice carrying authority that brooked no evasion. Your technical specifications describe Geller field stabilization, requiring living consciousness integrated with ship systems. She became something beyond human, didn't she? Grief broke through Seraphina's carefully maintained control as she remembered her sister's final moments. She chose to become bridge between real space and the warp, to transform herself into living conduit that would ensure our return. Her sacrifice was conscious choice, made with full understanding of its price and purpose. The words carried weight of truth that no augur array could question, emotion too genuine to fabricate. As the interrogation continued, Thane found himself recognizing patterns that defied conventional explanation. The sisters' survival was either miracle or elaborate deception, their transformation either blessing or curse disguised as gift. Yet the more he probed, the more convinced he became that events described transcended simple mission parameters. "I believe you have told me truth," he said finally, though his tone suggested recognition that truth itself might be layered like sedimentary rock, each stratum concealing depths below. "I also believe you have not told me all of it. The question becomes whether the knowledge you withhold serves the Imperium's interests or threatens them." Seraphina met his gaze directly, understanding that this moment would determine whether her surviving sisters lived as honored veterans or died as suspected heretics. The knowledge we carry is dangerous precisely because it is true, Inquisitor. Truth without wisdom becomes a weapon that destroys both wielder and target. We offer service, not revolution. Understanding, not upheaval. Let us prove our loyalty through actions rather than words. Thane studied her with growing certainty that he was witnessing events orchestrated by intelligence vast enough to plan across centuries, patient enough to wait for humanity to grow ready for revelations that would either save or damn the species they all served. The pattern was too perfect, the outcomes too precisely calibrated to serve purposes beyond mere relic retrieval. Divine orchestration, he murmured, almost to himself. Not chaos, not random chance. A deliberate act, a design spanning generations. He looked at Seraphina with new understanding. My grandfather sponsored your original mission, believing it divinely inspired. Perhaps divine inspiration operates through means more complex than simple faith rewarded. As the interrogation concluded, Thane walked away with profound questions that challenged his fundamental understanding of how divine will operated in the galaxy. He had expected to find either corruption or delusion, but instead encountered something far more disturbing. Evidence that the Emperor's love for humanity might manifest through orchestration so vast and patient that mortal minds could barely comprehend its scope. The investigation was far from over, but already he suspected that Seraphina Valdris and her surviving sisters were not heretics or victims of chaos, but instruments of a divine will that was now demanding the Imperium evolve or perish. The choice of how to proceed would require wisdom beyond his years and faith strong enough to embrace the possibility that the Emperor's protection might require humanity to grow beyond the comfortable certainties that had sustained them for 10 millennia. In the silence of the empty interrogation chamber, Thane bowed his head and prayed, not for certainty, but for the courage to be orchestrated without becoming puppet, to test without breaking, to listen without demanding to be comforted by lies that served no one save those who profited from ignorance. The quarantine chapel abhorred the unrelenting truth, bore the austere sanctity of inquisitorial design, its walls lined with hexagrammic wards that whispered protective litanies, while servo skulls maintained eternal vigil against corruption. Here, beneath stained glass windows, depicting martyrs whose names had been forgotten, but whose sacrifice endured, Canoness Superior Seraphina Valdris knelt in solitary prayer, the tears of Celestine resting in their containment field like captured stars. 3 days had passed since Inquisitor Thane's final interrogation, 3 days of silence that pressed against her consciousness like velvet, heavy with anticipation of revelations yet to come. The air shimmered without warning. Reality, bending like heated metal as presence manifested, that made the chapel's consecrated atmosphere sing with harmonics beyond mortal hearing. Light coalesced into form, not the blinding radiance of imperial propaganda, but something more complex, carrying within its luminescence the accumulated weight of every prayer offered across 10 millennia of warfare and faith. Saint Celestine stepped from that radiance, her armor gleaming with inner fire, her wings of living light beating with silent power, her features bearing the terrible beauty of one who had died for humanity's sake and learned that death was merely transition. My daughter, Celestine spoke with voices like cathedral bells cast from melted crowns, each word carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies that touched the soul directly. You have walked the path I prepared, carried the burden I designed, learn truths that I scattered like seeds across the galaxy's flesh. Seraphina rose with movements that had learned to carry revelation's weight, her dark eyes reflecting depths that had not existed before their journey began. Around them, the surviving sisters stirred from their meditations, drawn by a presence that made their transformed souls resonate like struck bells. "Living Saint," Seraphina replied formally, though her voice carried warmth that transcended protocol. I suspected divine orchestration, but the scope, the careful cultivation across generations, the precise timing of every trial, it suggests planning that spans millennia. Celestine moved with grace that belonged to beings who had transcended mortal limitations, her form shifting between the armored warrior of imperial iconography and something more essential, the embodiment of humanity's refusal to surrender. Your order was cultivated across centuries to produce individuals strong enough to witness truth and wise enough to share it without causing the destruction it seeks to prevent. The tears were never simple relics, but catalysts, fragments of futures that must be planted in soil prepared to receive them. Sister Hospitaller Miriel stepped forward, her healer's wisdom recognizing the weight settling upon her sisters like lead transmuted into purpose. "Then we are not merely witnesses but gardeners," she said quietly. "Seeds of understanding rather than proclamations of doctrine." "Yes," Celestine confirmed, her luminous gaze encompassing all the assembled sisters. "The Imperium faces extinction, not from external threats alone, but from internal stagnation, from faith that is calcified into rigid orthodoxy. You are humanity's future made manifest in present flesh, daughters who have learned to love your species enough to guide its evolution." The implications crashed over them like tidal forces. Sister Vanya, the scholar, whispered, "We are instruments of species-wide transformation," her voice carrying mixture of awe and terror. Around her, other sisters grappled with understanding that transcended individual choice. They were not merely faithful servants, but agents of change disguised as returning heroes. "The burden is vast," Seraphina acknowledged, thinking of Lysandra's sacrifice, of the sisters who had chosen martyrdom rather than face such implications. To carry such knowledge, to serve such purpose, it requires transformation beyond human limitations. Celestine's expression carried mixture of compassion and necessity that had defined every choice across 10,000 years of service. Growth is rarely without pain. Your purpose is not to destroy, but to illuminate, to offer a different path for faith, one that embraces the Emperor's plan in all its terrifying complexity, not just its palatable fictions. The weight of destiny settled upon Seraphina's shoulders like a mantle woven from necessity itself. She was no longer merely canoness of a returning order, but architect of humanity's future, guardian of revelations that would either save the species or damn it forever. The isolation of their knowledge had deepened, becoming a chasm between them and the rest of humanity. They were seeds of transformation, and seeds often required burial in darkness before they could bloom. "Speak to hearts, not thrones," Celestine continued, her form beginning to fade as the strain of manifestation reached its limits. "Choose rooms with single listeners over plazas with multitudes. Build sanctuaries inside minds first. Brick will follow when it must. You are echoes of truth that must resonate through the Imperium, not as conquest, but as conscious choice." As the saint's presence dissolved like morning mist, leaving behind only the faint scent of incense and the lingering sense of purpose too vast for mortal minds to fully encompass, Seraphina understood that their true mission was only beginning. They had been chosen not for their blind devotion, but for their capacity to see clearly while maintaining love for humanity, to serve as bridges between comfortable certainties and necessary truths. The gambit had been set in motion across centuries of careful preparation. Now it fell to her and her surviving sisters to plant seeds in soil that might not be ready to receive them, to serve purposes that demanded everything they had learned about balancing revelation with protection, understanding with the kind of love that sometimes required terrible choices to preserve what mattered most. The quarantine chapel had become a crucible where faith itself was being reforged in fires too hot for mortal souls to bear, its consecrated walls bearing witness to fractures that ran deeper than mere theological disagreement. Saint Celestine's revelation still hummed in the air, like the aftershock of divine thunder, her words echoing through dimensions that existed between heartbeat and breath, between prayer and understanding. The 23 surviving sisters of the Crimson Veil no longer knelt in the perfect unison that had once defined their order, but in clusters that reflected fault lines carved by truth too vast for simple acceptance or rejection. Their crimson armor gleamed beneath candlelight that seemed to flicker with uncertainty, each flame a question mark written in fire against the darkness of choices yet unmade. Sister Helena stood with rigid posture that spoke of convictions forged in the furnaces of 3 decades faithful service, her scarred features bearing the weight of someone who had stared into the abyss of revelation and chosen to step back from its edge. Around her gathered perhaps 7 sisters whose faith had learned to embrace complexity while refusing to abandon the bedrock certainties that had sustained humanity through 10 millennia of warfare and suffering. We cannot serve transformation that demands the destruction of everything we have sworn to protect, she declared, her voice carrying authority earned through countless battles against heretics who had spoken similar truths. The demon Prince Orestes offered us these same revelations wrapped in blasphemy. Now even the living saint echoes his words. How do we distinguish divine will from corruption so subtle it wears the face of our most sacred beliefs? Across the chapel's nave, Sister Vanya knelt in contemplation that had stretched across 3 sleepless days, her scholar's mind wrestling with implications that challenged every assumption she had held about the nature of faith and duty. Behind her, perhaps 8 sisters maintained vigil that spoke of souls transformed by understanding too profound for comfortable certainties. The Emperor's grand design transcends our limited comprehension, she whispered, her words carrying across stone that had learned to amplify prayer into something approaching divine communication. We have seen his hand orchestrating events across millennia, guiding humanity's evolution through trials that appeared as abandonment to those who could not perceive the greater pattern. To deny this knowledge is to reject the very purpose for which we were chosen. Between the opposing factions, Sister Hospitaller Miriel moved with gentle presence that had become bridge between understanding and compassion, her healer's wisdom recognizing that some wounds required acceptance rather than remedy. She had spent 40 years learning that love sometimes demanded terrible choices, that mercy could manifest through apparent cruelty when cruelty served the purpose of preserving what mattered most. Perhaps the question is not whether to act, but how to act with wisdom worthy of the trust placed in us, she suggested quietly, her voice carrying authority earned through decades of tending souls as well as bodies. We can plant seeds without uprooting gardens, offer illumination without demanding that blindness end immediately and completely. Canoness Superior, Serafina Valdris, stood at the chapel's heart, feeling the weight of command transform into something beyond mere authority as she studied the sisters who had followed her through realms where sanity frayed and faith became physics. They had entered the Eye of Terror as a unified order bound by common certainties and emerged as something more complex. Individuals who had learned to choose their devotion rather than simply inherit it. Servants who understood the price of service in ways that transcended blind obedience to comfortable doctrine. The tears of Celestine rested in their containment field like fragments of destiny itself, each obsidian crystal surface pulsing with visions that hurt to witness directly. Within their dark depths, futures blazed with potential glory and damnation. Timelines where humanity evolved beyond current limitations, where the Imperium learned to embrace growth rather than stagnation, where faith became conscious partnership with divine will rather than submission to dogmatic interpretation, but also futures where revelation sparked civil wars that consumed entire sectors, where knowledge became weapon that destroyed both wielder and target, where the species fractured beyond repair in pursuit of transformation it proved incapable of bearing. "I understand the weight of what Saint Celestine has revealed," Serafina announced, her voice carrying across the chapel with finality that made even the servo-skulls pause in their eternal circling. "We are not merely witnesses to divine will, but instruments of humanity's evolution, seeds of transformation scattered across the galaxy's flesh. The question before us is not whether to serve this purpose, but how to serve it without becoming the instrument of our species' destruction." She lifted the largest tear, feeling its weight like a fragment of eternity compressed into crystal form. "We have 3 paths before us. We can remain silent, preserving unity through comfortable lies while humanity stagnates toward extinction. We can proclaim these truths openly, risking civil war that would tear the Imperium apart in pursuit of transformation it may not survive. Or we can walk the surgeon's path, precise, careful, selective in our revelations." Sister Helena stepped forward, her conviction warring with respect for the commander who had led them through impossible trials. "The ecclesiarchy hierarchy will denounce us as heretics the moment we speak truths that challenge their authority, Canoness. They profit from ignorance, maintain power through the preservation of comfortable certainties. They will not welcome illumination that threatens their position." "Then we do not approach the hierarchy," Serafina replied, with clarity born of 3 centuries, spent learning that necessity ruled over preference in realms beyond mortal comprehension. "We seek individuals, cardinals whose faith has grown strong enough to embrace complexity without abandoning love for humanity. Preachers whose devotion transcends political ambition. Confessors whose understanding encompasses more than rigid doctrine. We identify those prepared to receive seeds of understanding and plant them carefully, selectively, in soil that can nurture growth rather than corruption." Inquisitor Thane's presence pressed against the chapel's sealed doors like patient gravity, his willingness to wait speaking of recognition that events within would reshape the Imperium's future. When Serafina finally admitted him, their gazes met with understanding that transcended rank or protocol. "You are about to choose which future we deserve," his expression communicated without words. "I have identified 3 individuals whose minds and hearts are prepared for partial revelation," Serafina continued, addressing both her fractured order and the Inquisitor, whose family had sponsored their original mission. "Cardinal Matthias of the Calixian Synod, whose reforms have saved hive worlds without fanfare or political theatre. Preacher Joachim of the Redemptionist Missions, whose sermons have transformed riots into assemblies of hope. Archivist Cornelius of the Scriptorum Sanctus, whose pen has elevated saints and buried corruption without changing his humble demeanor. We will show them carefully selected visions from the tears, revelations shaped to fit their capacity for understanding and their ability to apply wisdom without causing destruction. Sister Vanya began calculating the theological implications, her scholar's mind already parsing how dangerous truths could be nested within acceptable doctrine. Parables within parables, she murmured with growing excitement. Truth carried in vessels that appear orthodox to casual observation, but reveal deeper meaning to those prepared to see. The schism was complete. Fault lines that had been growing since their encounter with Orestes, now splitting the order into three distinct paths. Sister Helena and her followers would serve as guardians of orthodoxy, preserving traditional faith while watching for signs that fuller revelation was needed. Sister Vanya's faction would become active agents of transformation, seeking positions within the ecclesiarchy where they could plant seeds of understanding in minds prepared to receive them. Sister Muriel would walk between both paths, serving as bridge and healer, helping others navigate the space between comfortable certainties and necessary truths. "We are no longer a single order," Serafina acknowledged, feeling grief and pride warring in her chest as she watched the sisters she had led through impossible trials prepare to scatter like seeds across the galaxy's flesh. "But we remain sisters, bound by shared understanding of what love requires when love encompasses entire species. We carry the Emperor's will in forms that transcend simple doctrine, serve his purpose through means that challenge comfortable assumptions while preserving the essential truth of his love for humanity." As the sisters prepared to depart on paths that would carry them to different worlds, different duties, different destinies, Serafina lifted the tears of Celestine and felt their weight like fragments of the future itself. The choice had been made, the die cast with precision worthy of the Emperor's own strategic genius. Humanity's evolution would begin not through conquest or proclamation, but through quiet conversations in private chambers, through seeds planted in hearts prepared to receive them, through love that had learned to embrace transformation as conscious choice rather than imposed change. The gambit Celestine had designed across centuries of careful preparation was finally in motion, and its outcome would determine whether the Imperium learned to grow beyond its current limitations or perished from inability to adapt to challenges that demanded more than orthodox responses could provide. They had become gardeners of the future, tending growth that would either bloom into humanity's salvation or spread like wildfire to consume everything they had sworn to protect. The first tremor struck on the feast day of St. Drusus, when Cardinal Matthias of the Calixian Synod opened his private chambers to 6 trusted deacons and showed them visions that made reality weep. The tear of Celestine blazed above his simple wooden table like a fragment of eternity compressed into obsidian crystal, its faceted surface catching candlelight and refracting it into harmonies that resonated in frequencies beyond mortal hearing. The assembled clerics watched in silence as the relic revealed glimpses of the Emperor's true design, not the comfortable certainties of imperial doctrine, but the terrible complexity of love that encompassed necessity, guidance that manifested through orchestrated trials, protection that required allowing humanity to grow beyond the limitations that had once sheltered them from truths too vast for unprepared minds to bear. When the vision faded, leaving only the scent of ozone and the lingering taste of revelation on their tongues, Cardinal Matthias spoke with voice that carried the weight of someone whose faith had been simultaneously shattered and reborn. "We have been shown the Emperor's will in forms that transcend our current understanding," he announced, his words carefully chosen to nest heretical truths within orthodox terminology. "The visions suggest that our species stands at a crossroads where continued stagnation leads to extinction, While conscious evolution offers salvation through trials that will test every assumption we have cherished for 10 millennia. Across the galaxy, similar scenes unfolded in chambers where dangerous truths could be shared without triggering the reflexive violence of orthodoxy threatened. Preacher Joachim knelt in a manufactorum-turned sanctuary on Maccabeus Quintus, where rust flaked from walls like discarded certainties, while the tear showed him futures where riots transformed into processions because leaders chose to listen before commanding. Archivist Cornelius pressed trembling quill to parchment in the depths of the scriptorum, Sanctus recording revelations that hurt to witness directly while nesting them within commentary that appeared as natural extension of accepted doctrine to casual observation. The surviving sisters of the Crimson Veil had scattered like seeds from a pod that had learned to embrace its own destruction, each carrying fragments of understanding too dangerous for concentration in single location. Sister Vanya had accepted assignment to the theological seminaries of Macraga, her scholar's mind already composing treatises that would challenge fundamental assumptions while appearing as orthodox scholarship to supervisors, whose understanding remained comfortably limited. Her faction worked with surgical precision, identifying students whose intellects could grasp expanded interpretations without abandoning essential devotion to humanity's cause. Sister Helena had chosen the fortress monastery of Cadia's spiritual successor, where her traditional faith served as anchor for souls whose understanding might otherwise drift into dangerous waters. She and her followers maintained vigil against the very truths they had witnessed, believing that humanity required gradual preparation rather than immediate revelation. Their presence provided necessary counterbalance, ensuring that transformation proceeded with wisdom rather than revolutionary fervor that could tear the Imperium apart in pursuit of evolution it might not survive. Sister Hospitaller Muriel walked the pilgrim routes between worlds, her gentle presence preparing hearts for revelations their minds were not yet ready to receive. She tended wounds both physical and spiritual, her 40 years of healing experience teaching her to recognize when growth required acceptance of scars rather than their denial. Her words planted seeds of understanding in soil that would nurture them across generations, patient cultivation that honored both truth and mercy. Inquisitor Cassius Thane found himself caught in the crucible of his own crisis of faith, as reports flooded his cogitators describing theological irregularities spreading through the ecclesiarchy hierarchy like fever through a hive city's undercity. Cardinals questioning doctrines that had remained unchanged for millennia. Preachers delivering sermons that emphasized humanity's potential rather than its inherent corruption. Archivists discovering scriptural passages that supported interpretations previously deemed heretical by automatic reflex rather than careful examination. His steel-grey eyes, so reminiscent of the grandfather who had originally sponsored Seraphina's mission, reflected depths of understanding that had not existed before witnessing evidence of divine orchestration spanning centuries. Every instinct trained into him by decades of inquisitorial service screamed that he was witnessing the early stages of massive heretical corruption that required immediate purging with extreme prejudice. Yet his intellect recognized patterns too precise for random chance, evidence suggesting that these changes served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. I have become judge of revelations that challenge the very nature of judgment itself, he confided to his private logs, his voice carrying undertones of someone whose world had shifted beneath foundations he had never thought to question. If the Emperor's will encompasses orchestrations so subtle it appears as coincidence to those who cannot perceive the greater pattern, then what constitutes loyalty? Blind preservation of comfortable certainties, or conscious partnership in designs that demand growth beyond current limitations. The schism was spreading through the Imperium's spiritual infrastructure like cracks through cathedral stone, each revelation creating new fractures, while paradoxically strengthening the whole structure through improved understanding of its own nature. On distant worlds, in private chambers and public forums, conversations had begun that would reshape humanity's relationship with its own faith. Dangerous truths nested within acceptable doctrine. Heretical revelations disguised as natural extensions of orthodox interpretation. Seeds of transformation planted in hearts prepared to receive them without immediately rejecting what challenged comfortable assumptions. Canoness. Superior Seraphina Valdris stood in her private sanctum aboard the Immaculate Sorrow, watching stars that had burned since humanity's first steps beyond terror, while feeling the weight of consequences spreading across the galaxy like ripples from stones cast into still water. The isolation pressed against her consciousness like physical force as she contemplated the magnitude of what they had set in motion. Not merely theological debate, but fundamental questioning of assumptions that had sustained the species through 10 millennia of warfare and suffering. She understood now the true nature of St. Celestine's gambit, the patient orchestration that had cultivated their order across generations to produce individuals capable of carrying revelations too dangerous for casual distribution. They had become gardeners of humanity's future, tending growth that might bloom into salvation or spread like wildfire to consume everything they sought to protect. The comfortable certainties of her previous existence had been replaced by responsibility too vast for individual shoulders to bear, understanding that transcended simple acceptance or rejection. The price of truth was being paid in uncertainty, in the loss of orthodoxy that had provided anchor against the chaos of existence in a universe that devoured the weak and demanded strength from those who would survive its trials. Whether that price would prove worthwhile depended upon humanity's capacity to evolve beyond current limitations without losing the essential truths that made such evolution meaningful, rather than mere change for its own sake. As reports continued arriving from across the galaxy, theological, debates that challenged millennium-old assumptions, scriptural discoveries that supported expanded interpretations, faithful servants whose devotion had learned to embrace complexity without abandoning love for the species they served, Seraphina recognized that they had succeeded beyond their most ambitious hopes and failed beyond their darkest fears. The transformation of imperial faith had begun, but its outcome remained balanced on possibilities that could lead either to humanity's conscious ascension or its destruction through civil wars that would make previous conflicts appear as disagreements between friends. The Emperor's love for his children was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether that love could encompass transformation as profound as the difference between what humanity had been and what it might become. The Cathedral of St. Sebastian Thor rose from Ophelia VII's amber plains like a prayer carved from stone and desperate ambition, its spires piercing heaven with accusations against mortality, while its foundations delved deep into bedrock that had witnessed the birth and death of empires across 10 millennia of warfare and faith. The great bells tolled with voices that seemed to have learned sorrow, their bronze tongues speaking lamentations that rolled across the holy city like waves breaking against shores of certainty. Within the cathedral's hallowed nave, beneath stained glass windows that transformed distant starlight into something approaching divinity, the ecclesiarchy's highest authorities had gathered to render judgment upon revelations that threatened to reshape the very nature of human faith itself. Cardinal archbishops, whose words moved worlds, sat in judgment alongside confessors whose sermons had sparked crusades, their faces bearing the weight of decisions that would echo across millennia, while servo skulls circled overhead like mechanical vultures, recording every word for posterity's harsh examination. The air hung thick with incense that clung like fog in a graveyard, sweet and suffocating, while candlelight flickered with uncertainty across features carved by decades of unwavering orthodoxy. Time had narrowed to a corridor between choices already made, and every footfall upon consecrated stone sounded like the closing of doors that would never open again. Canoness Superior Serafina Valdris stood at the cathedral's heart, her crimson armour gleaming beneath light that seemed to judge both accuser and accused with equal severity, the tears of Celestine resting in their reliquary like fragments of destiny awaiting final disposition. 3 months had passed since the schism began spreading through the Imperium's spiritual infrastructure like cracks through cathedral stone. 3 months of theological debates that challenged assumptions undisturbed since the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne, of scriptural discoveries that supported interpretations previously deemed heretical by reflex rather than careful examination. Among the assembled inquisitors, who maintained silent vigil with weapons capable of ending heretical discourse with surgical precision, Cassius Thane stood with steel-grey eyes reflecting depths of understanding that warred with duties inherited from generations of faithful service. His grandfather's legacy pressed against revelations that challenged the very nature of loyalty itself, and Serafina could see the terrible weight of choice settling upon his shoulders like lead transmuted into purpose. "You can still withdraw," Thane murmured during a moment when protocol allowed private consultation, his voice a careful eddy in the tidal hall of judgment. "Speak only the minimum required. Let me work the rest across years rather than minutes. Plant seeds in soil prepared to receive them rather than casting them upon stone. I was sent to walk where years cannot go, Inquisitor," she replied, with gentle finality, recognizing the love that motivated his offer, while understanding the necessity that transcended personal preference. "I ask only that you witness without averting your gaze. If there is mercy to be found in what follows, it will need a keeper to tend its growth." Cardinal Archbishop Decius rose with movements that spoke of authority earned through 7 decades of faithful service, his voice carrying across stone that had learned to amplify judgment into something approaching divine pronouncement. "Serafina Valdris," he intoned with ritual gravity, "you stand accused of spreading doctrinal corruption disguised as divine revelation, of undermining the Emperor's sacred orthodoxy through lies wrapped in truth's clothing, of sowing discord among the faithful through visions that challenge the very foundations upon which our species' survival depends." The accusations rolled through the cathedral like thunder, each charge weighted with evidence that could not be denied. Ecclesiarchy members across 17 sectors reporting theological irregularities that traced directly to her influence, cardinals questioning doctrines that had remained unchanged for millennia, preachers delivering sermons that emphasized humanity's potential rather than its inherent corruption, archivists discovering scriptural passages that supported expanded interpretations of the Emperor's will. Serafina raised her gaze to meet the assembled authorities, feeling the isolation of her knowledge press against her consciousness like physical force as she contemplated words that would either vindicate her mission or seal her fate as history's most dangerous heretic. "Honored cardinals," she began, her voice carrying across stone with authority that transcended rank or protocol. "I stand before you not as heretic but as daughter who has learned to love the Emperor, not for what we believed him to be, but for what he truly is." She lifted the largest tear of Celestine, feeling its weight like a fragment of eternity compressed into obsidian crystal, its faceted surface catching candlelight and refracting it into harmonies that resonated in frequencies beyond mortal hearing. The visions I have shared are not corruption but revelation, not lies but truths too complex for comfortable certainties to contain. Behold the Emperor's true design, witnessed in realms where faith becomes physics and devotion takes physical form. The relic blazed with light that pierced flesh and bone to illuminate souls directly, flooding the cathedral with visions that made reality weep for possibilities both magnificent and terrible. The assembled authorities witnessed the Emperor not as the golden god of imperial doctrine, but as architect of necessity, gardener tending humanity's growth through trials that appeared as abandonment to those who could not perceive the greater pattern. They saw him as surgeon whose love required cutting away weakness, as tyrant whose dominion served protection rather than oppression, as father whose children must learn to choose their devotion rather than inherit it through comfortable ignorance. The Horus heresy erupted before them with crushing intimacy, not as tragic betrayal, but as orchestrated catalyst, the War Master's fall guided by hands that loved him enough to sacrifice him for humanity's evolution. They witnessed the siege of terror revealed in its true purpose, forge that would transform the species from collection of scattered tribes into weapon capable of surviving wars that dwarfed current understanding. The Great Crusade appeared stripped of comfortable mythology, systematic expansion designed to create enemies that would prevent stagnation, conflicts that would teach humanity to grow or perish in the attempt. He knew, Serafina continued as visions painted the cathedral walls with futures yet unborn, her voice steady as stone while reality bent around revelations too vast for unprepared minds to process. Knew that Horus would fall, knew that the throne would become both gallows and gift, knew that comfortable certainties would become tomb if humanity failed to evolve beyond current limitations. Every trial, every sacrifice, every moment of apparent abandonment serves the purpose of making us stronger, wiser, more capable of conscious partnership in his grand design. Cardinal Matthias, whose private chambers had witnessed the first careful sharing of these revelations, stood with trembling hands pressed against the altar rail as understanding crashed over him like tidal force. "If this is truth," he whispered, his voice carrying across stone that amplified doubt into something approaching divine communication, "then our entire understanding of faith, duty, and devotion requires not abandonment, but conscious evolution." "Precisely," Serafina replied, with gentle authority, her gaze sweeping across faces that reflected the terrible beauty of certainty dissolving into something more complex and precious. Not the destruction of faith, but its maturation from blind submission to conscious choice, from comfortable ignorance to understanding that embraces complexity without abandoning love for the species we serve. The final vision blazed with intensity that made several cardinals cry out in recognition or terror. Futures where humanity ascended beyond current limitations through conscious partnership with divine will, where the warp became tool rather than threat, where psychic children were trained rather than feared, where the species evolved into something capable of standing against horrors not yet imagined. But interwoven with these possibilities were darker timelines where revelations sparked civil wars that consumed entire sectors, where knowledge became weapon that destroyed both wielder and target, where the Imperium fractured beyond repair in pursuit of transformation, it proved incapable of bearing. "The choice belongs to you," Serafina announced as the visions faded, leaving only the scent of ozone and the lingering taste of revelation on tongues unprepared for such intensity. "Embrace transformation through conscious faith, or preserve stagnation through comfortable orthodoxy. But know that the Emperor's love encompasses both paths, and his design will unfold regardless of whether we choose to participate consciously or remain instruments played by hands we refuse to acknowledge. The judgment that followed carried the dignity of inevitability, martyrdom disguised as justice, execution presented as preservation of orthodoxy against corruption, too subtle to combat through conventional means. Cardinal Archbishop Decius pronounced sentence with voice that carried the weight of someone whose world had shifted beneath foundations never previously questioned, his words falling like stones into water that would ripple across the galaxy for generations yet unborn. As the pyre was prepared and final prayers offered, Seraphina walked toward her death, not as heretic, but as gardener whose work had reached completion, understanding that her sacrifice would serve the same purpose as her life, catalyst for transformation that would spread through the Imperium like seeds scattered by wind, taking root in hearts prepared to receive truths too dangerous for casual distribution. She looked to Thane one final time, seeing in his steel-grey eyes the promise that he would become keeper of the mercy she had planted, guardian of revelations that would bloom across generations in forms she might never witness, but whose necessity she had learned to embrace. The flames that consumed her body could not touch the understanding she had planted in minds ready to nurture growth rather than suppress it, and her final words carried across the cathedral like prophecy made manifest. Love is a blade that cuts both victim and savior, but it is the only blade sharp enough to carve paths toward futures worth the price of their making. Let my death be not ending but leverage, the final lesson that conscious sacrifice serves, transformation beyond individual understanding. As fire transformed flesh into light, Seraphina's martyrdom became the spark that would ignite humanity's next evolution, proof that faith strong enough to embrace truth could transcend even death, to plant seeds of change in soil prepared by centuries of careful cultivation.